Seal jokingly asked for the old veteran's rank, until his reply made the entire mess hall freeze. The cabin of United Airlines Flight 2847 from San Diego to Washington, D.C., had settled into the comfortable monotony of cross-country travel. Business travelers tapped away at laptops, families managed restless children, and flight attendants rolled beverage carts down narrow aisles with practiced efficiency. In seat 32F, an elderly man sat quietly, gazing out the window at the clouds below. Harold Hal Bennett was 82 years old, wearing a simple button-down shirt and khaki pants. His weathered hands rested on a well-worn paperback novel, though he'd read the same page 3 times without absorbing a word. His mind was elsewhere, as it often was these days, drifting back through memories of a life lived at speeds most people couldn't imagine. The flight attendant stopped at his row. "Can I get you anything to drink, sir?" "Just water, thank you," Hal replied with a gentle smile. She poured him a plastic cup of water and moved on. The man in the seat next to him, a young businessman in an expensive suit, barely looked up from his phone. To everyone around him, Hal was just another elderly passenger, invisible, unremarkable, forgettable. They had no idea who he was. They had no idea what he'd done. And they certainly had no idea that in the next 30 minutes, this quiet old man would be the only thing standing between them and disaster. The first sign of trouble came without warning. Captain Jennifer Walsh was reviewing their flight plan when her co-pilot, First Officer Mike Torres, suddenly stiffened in his seat. "Jen, we've got a problem." "What kind of problem?" "Engine 2 is showing abnormal vibration. Temperatures climbing fast." Captain Walsh's eyes moved to her instruments. The readings were escalating rapidly, too rapidly for a normal malfunction. "Run the checklist," she ordered, her voice calm despite the spike of adrenaline. "Let's see if we can stabilize it." But even as Torres worked through the emergency procedures, the situation deteriorated. Warning lights illuminated across the panel. The vibration in Engine 2 had become severe enough that passengers were starting to notice. "It's not responding," Torres said, tension creeping into his voice. "Jen, we need to shut it down." "Agreed. Shut down Engine 2. Prepare for single-engine operation." They were 40 minutes from Washington, D.C., flying at 38,000 feet over the Appalachian Mountains. A single-engine failure wasn't catastrophic. Commercial aircraft were designed to fly on one engine. But as Torres began the shutdown procedure, something else happened. The entire electrical system flickered. For 3 seconds, every screen in the cockpit went dark. The lights died. The controls stopped responding. The massive Boeing 737 became a powerless glider at 38,000 feet. Then the systems came back online, but nothing was right. Half the instruments showed conflicting readings. The autopilot had disengaged. And worst of all, they'd lost most of their hydraulic pressure. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," Captain Walsh transmitted. "United 2847. We have multiple system failures. Engine fire, electrical failure, hydraulic failure. Declaring an emergency. Requesting immediate priority landing and emergency equipment." The response came immediately from Air Traffic Control. "United 2847, roger your mayday. We're clearing traffic. Nearest suitable airport is..." The radio cut out. Walsh tried again. Nothing. Their primary communication system was dead. "Try the backup radio," she ordered. Torres switched frequencies, but the backup was also non-responsive. They were flying a crippled aircraft with no way to communicate with the ground. And then things got worse. "Jen," Torres said, his voice tight, "the flight controls are getting sluggish. I think we're losing more hydraulics." Walsh gripped her control yoke, feeling the resistance. Torres was right. The aircraft was becoming harder to control by the second. At this rate, they'd lose the ability to maneuver entirely within minutes. She made a decision. "I'm putting out a cabin alert. Prepare for emergency landing. And Mike, start looking for any open ground. We might not make it to an airport." In the cabin, the passenger address system crackled to life with Captain Walsh's voice, professionally calm but unmistakably serious. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain. We are experiencing technical difficulties, and we'll be making an emergency landing. Flight attendants, Prepare the cabin for emergency procedures. Passengers, please follow all crew instructions carefully. The reaction was immediate. Nervous murmurs turned to frightened gasps. Children began crying. A woman 2 rows ahead of Hal started hyperventilating. The businessman next to him finally looked up from his phone, his face pale. "Oh my God," someone said. "We're going to crash." The flight attendants moved through the cabin with trained efficiency, demonstrating brace positions and checking that seat belts were fastened. But Hal could see the fear in their eyes. This wasn't a drill. This was the scenario they trained for but hoped would never happen. Hal remained calm, his hand steady on his armrests. He'd been in worse situations than this. Much worse. But that was a lifetime ago, when he'd been a different person. Or had he? As the cabin descended into barely controlled panic, as passengers made frantic phone calls to loved ones and prayed and cried, Hal quietly unbuckled his seat belt and stood up. A flight attendant immediately moved toward him. "Sir, you need to remain seated with your seat belt fastened." "I need to speak with the captain," Hal said calmly. "Sir, that's not possible right now. Please sit down." "I'm a pilot," Hal said, his voice still quiet but carrying a note of authority that made the flight attendant pause. "I might be able to help." "Sir, we have trained pilots in the cockpit." "I know you do, but their radios are out, which means they can't coordinate with air traffic control or emergency services. And based on the aircraft behavior, they're dealing with multiple cascading failures. I've dealt with this scenario before. Please, let me speak with them." The flight attendant looked uncertain, torn between protocol and the obvious sincerity in the old man's eyes. Then the aircraft shuddered violently, dropping what felt like 100 feet in an instant. Screams filled the cabin. "Follow me," the flight attendant said. She led Hal to the cockpit door and knocked in the emergency pattern. After a moment, it opened a crack. First Officer Torres looked out, his face showing the strain of the crisis. "What is it?" "This passenger says he's a pilot and might be able to help," the attendant said. Torres looked at Hal skeptically. "Sir, I appreciate the offer, but we're handling it." "Are you?" Hal asked gently. "Because you've lost your radios, you're losing hydraulics, and based on how this aircraft is handling, you're about 10 minutes from losing all flight control authority. You're also over mountainous terrain, with limited options for emergency landing." Torres stared at him. "How do you know?" "Because I've been there. Different aircraft, same situation. Let me help." Torres glanced back at Captain Walsh, who had overheard the conversation. She looked at Hal for a long moment, making a split-second judgment call. "Let him in," she said. Hal entered the cockpit and immediately assessed the situation. His eyes moved across the instruments with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent thousands of hours reading similar panels. "Captain, how much hydraulic pressure do you have left?" "We're down to about 30% and dropping," Walsh replied. "We've lost redundancy on all 3 systems." "And your electrical?" "Intermittent. We're on backup power, but it's unstable." Hal nodded, his mind working through possibilities. "You've got a cascading failure pattern. The engine fire triggered an electrical short, which compromised your hydraulic pumps. Your backup systems are being overwhelmed trying to compensate." "That's our assessment too," Torres said. "But knowing what's wrong doesn't help us fly this thing." "Actually it does," Hal said. He pointed to a specific panel. "You're routing all your backup power through the primary distribution system. That's overloading it. You need to isolate the flight-critical systems and run them directly from the backup generator. It'll give you less total power, but what you have will be stable." Walsh and Torres exchanged glances. What Hal was suggesting wasn't in their standard emergency procedures. But nothing about this situation was standard. "Do it," Walsh ordered. Torres began reconfiguring the electrical system according to Hal's instructions. Within seconds, the flickering stopped. The instrument stabilized. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. "Good," Hal said. "Now your hydraulics. You can't stop the leak, but you can manage it. Reduce your control inputs to the absolute minimum. Small, smooth adjustments. Don't fight the aircraft. Work with it. You're flying a wounded bird now. Treat her gently. We need to land this thing. Walsh said. But we can't communicate with ATC. We don't know if they've cleared the airspace or if there's emergency equipment standing by. You have a transponder, correct? Even if the radios are down. Yes, but... Set it to 7,700. Emergency code. ATC will see it on radar. They'll know you're in trouble and clear the space. They'll have emergency crews ready at whatever airport you're heading for. Torres immediately changed the transponder code. Now, Hal said, where are you planning to land? We were trying for Roanoke, Walsh said, but I don't think we'll make it. We're losing too much altitude. Hal looked at the navigation display, calculating vectors and distances with mental math honed over decades. You're right. Roanoke's too far. But there's a regional airport 15 miles northeast. Smaller runway, but adequate for a 737 if you can keep it together long enough. We don't have approach data for that airport loaded, Torres pointed out. You don't need it. Visual approach. I know that airport. I learned to fly there 60 years ago. I can talk you in. Captain Walsh made another quick decision. Mike, turn heading 045. Let's find this airport. As Torres adjusted their course, Walsh asked the question they were all thinking. Sir, who exactly are you? Because you're not just any pilot. Hal smiled slightly. My name is Harold Bennett. Call sign Ugly 6. I flew F-4 Phantoms in Vietnam, then test pilot for the Navy for 20 years after that. I helped develop the fly-by-wire systems that eventually became standard on commercial aircraft. I've dealt with every catastrophic failure scenario you can imagine, and a few you can't. The cockpit went silent for a moment. Then Torres let out a breath he'd been holding. You're Ugly 6? The Ugly 6. I read about you at the academy. You were a legend. I was a pilot who got lucky a few times, Hal corrected gently. Now let's make sure we all get lucky today. Captain, level off at 12,000 feet. We need to stay high enough to clear the mountains, but low enough to set up a proper approach. For the next 10 minutes, Hal guided them through the emergency descent. He called out headings and altitudes from memory, navigating them through mountain passes toward the small regional airport he'd learned to fly at as a young man. The aircraft was barely responding now. The hydraulic pressure had dropped to critical levels. Captain Walsh was using every bit of her skill just to keep them airborne. There, Hal said, pointing through the windscreen. 2 o'clock, about 8 miles. That's your runway. Walsh saw it, a thin strip of concrete carved into the valley, surrounded by mountains. It looked impossibly small from their altitude. We're too high and too fast, Torres said, looking at their approach angle. Then we'll slip it, Hal said calmly. Captain, put in full left rudder and opposite aileron. We'll bleed off altitude and speed sideways. It's not pretty, but it works. Walsh hesitated. A forward slip was an advanced maneuver, rarely used in commercial aviation, especially not in an emergency situation with failing controls. Trust me, Hal said quietly. I've done this before. You can do it. Walsh took a breath and committed. She applied left rudder and right aileron, putting the aircraft into a controlled sideways slip. The nose pointed one direction while the aircraft moved another, using the fuselage as an air brake. It worked. Their descent rate increased while their forward speed decreased. The airport grew larger in the windscreen. Perfect, Hal said. Hold it, hold it. Now level out and line up with the runway. Walsh released a slip and struggled to line up the aircraft with the narrow runway. The controls were sluggish, barely responding. She was essentially flying a glider with degraded controls. You're high on the glide slope, Hal said. Increase your descent rate slightly. I'm trying, but the controls. I know. Use your rudder for fine adjustments. The rudder's on a separate hydraulic system that's still got some pressure. Use it to steer. Walsh adapted, using techniques she'd never needed in years of commercial flying, but that were second nature to someone like Hal who'd flown damaged aircraft. They crossed the runway threshold at 160 knots, faster than ideal, but manageable. The runway stretched out ahead of them, surrounded by emergency vehicles, with lights flashing. Here we go, Walsh said, pulling back on the yoke for the flare. The main wheels touched down hard but straight. The nose wheel dropped, and Walsh immediately applied maximum braking. But with compromised hydraulics, the brakes were weak. "We're not stopping fast enough," Torres said, watching the runway end approach rapidly. "Deploy the spoilers manually," Hal ordered, "and reverse thrust on the good engine, full power." They were doing everything right, but the aircraft was still moving too fast. The end of the runway was coming up, and beyond it was a grass field, and then trees. "Brace," Walsh commanded. The aircraft rolled off the end of the runway into the grass. The ground was soft from recent rain, and the wheels dug in, dramatically slowing their momentum. They carved twin furrows through the field, finally coming to rest less than 100 yards from the tree line. For a moment, nobody moved. The cockpit was silent except for the ticking of cooling metal and the distant sound of emergency sirens. Then Walsh let out a shaky breath. "We're down." "We're alive," Torres corrected. They looked at Hal, who was calmly unfastening his seat belt. "Nice landing, Captain," he said. "A little firm, but given the circumstances, I'd call that a success." "We wouldn't have made it without you," Walsh said. "Mr. Bennett, Ugly Six, I don't know how to thank you." "You just did what needed to be done," Hal replied. "Same as any pilot would. Now, let's get these passengers evacuated before someone decides to panic." The emergency evacuation was orderly and efficient. All 157 passengers and 6 crew members exited the aircraft safely via emergency slides. Minor injuries, a sprained ankle, some bruises, but nothing serious. Against all odds, everyone had survived. As passengers gathered in the grass beside the runway, many were crying with relief, hugging loved ones they'd called during the crisis. Emergency responders moved among them, checking for injuries and providing comfort. The businessman who'd been sitting next to Hal approached him, his expensive suit now rumpled and grass-stained. "I just heard what you did," he said. "You saved us. All of us." "The pilots saved you," Hal corrected. "I just offered some suggestions." "Don't be modest. I heard the flight attendants talking. Without you, we would have. He couldn't finish the sentence. "But you didn't," Hal said gently. "You're safe. That's what matters." As the initial chaos of the emergency began to settle, a new sound caught everyone's attention. The roar of jet engines, low and fast. 2 fighter aircraft screamed overhead, then banked sharply and came around for another pass. F-35 Lightning IIs, the most advanced fighter jets in the U.S. military arsenal. They'd been scrambled when United 2847's transponder showed an emergency code, and the aircraft had lost radio contact. Standard protocol for a potential hijacking or catastrophic emergency. Send fighters to assess the situation and provide escort. The jets circled once more, then climbed away and disappeared into the clouds. Their work was done, but a few minutes later, one of them returned. It came in low and slow, flying a precise pattern over the crash site. Then, over the airport's emergency frequency that was being broadcast to the gathered emergency responders, a voice crackled through. "Attention ground units, this is Viper 1-1, lead F-35 on station. We have visual confirmation of the aircraft and all personnel appear safe. Well done on the emergency landing. Is Ugly Six on site? We're receiving information that Ugly Six was aboard that aircraft." One of the emergency coordinators looked confused and keyed his radio. "Viper 1-1, can you confirm that call sign?" "Ugly Six." "Affirmative. Ugly Six. Vietnam Era F for pilot. Call sign Ugly Six. We're being told he helped land that aircraft. If he's on site, we'd like to pay our respects." Hal, standing in the crowd of passengers, closed his eyes and smiled slightly. After all these years, the call sign still followed him. An airport official who'd overheard the exchange approached Hal. "Sir, are you Ugly Six?" "That was a long time ago," Hal said. "But it's you." "Yes." The official keyed his radio. "Viper 1-1, Ugly Six is on site and safe." There was a pause then. "Copy that. Ugly Six, this is Viper 1-1. Don't know if you can hear me, but sir, it's an honor. What you did today, and what you did back in your day. You're why a lot of us wanted to fly. Thank you for bringing them home safe. The F-35 came around one more time, slower this time. As it passed over the gathered crowd, the pilot waggled the aircraft's wings, the traditional aviation salute, a gesture of respect from one pilot to another. Several people in the crowd were filming on their phones. Someone had overheard the radio exchange, and word was spreading quickly about who Hal really was. A young boy, maybe 10 years old, approached Hal hesitantly. "Mister, are you really a famous pilot?" Hal knelt down to the boy's level. "I was a pilot a long time ago. Not sure about famous. But you saved us, right? When the plane was breaking." "The pilot saved you," Hal said. "They did all the hard work. I just reminded them of some things they already knew." "My dad says pilots are heroes," the boy said. Hal smiled. "Your dad is right. But today's heroes are Captain Walsh and First Officer Torres in that cockpit. They're the ones who kept everyone safe." By evening, the story had hit national news. Cell phone footage from passengers showed the damaged aircraft resting in the grass field. Interviews with survivors told of the terrifying mid-flight emergency and the miraculous landing. But the story that captured public imagination was about Harold "Ugly Six" Bennett, the 82-year-old legendary test pilot who happened to be on board and had helped guide the crippled aircraft to safety. News crews tracked Hal to a hotel near the airport, where all the passengers had been temporarily housed. "Mr. Bennett, can you tell us what happened up there?" Hal, looking tired but composed, faced the cameras. "I happen to have some experience with the type of emergency the crew was facing. I offered to help. They accepted. That's all. But sources say you essentially co-piloted the aircraft to safety with degraded systems." "Sources are exaggerating," Hal said firmly. "Captain Walsh and First Officer Torres are highly skilled pilots who handled an extremely difficult situation with professionalism and courage. I simply provided some technical suggestions based on past experience. They deserve all the credit." "Mr. Bennett, you're a legend in aviation circles. You flew combat missions in Vietnam, then became a test pilot, helping develop systems that are now standard on modern aircraft. Yet you've lived in relative obscurity for years. Why come forward now?" "I didn't come forward," Hal pointed out. "I was just a passenger on a flight that had problems. I did what anyone with my experience would do. I helped where I could." "But surely you understand that what you did was extraordinary." Hal was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. What was extraordinary was watching two pilots I'd never met trust advice from an old man they didn't know, in the middle of a crisis when every instinct probably told them to handle it themselves. That took courage and humility. That's what saved those people. Not me. Them. The interview ended, but the questions continued. Over the next few days, as the NTSB investigated the incident and the passengers returned home, Hal found himself thrust into a spotlight he'd never sought. He received calls from the Navy, from aviation organizations, from museums wanting to honor him. The mayor of the town where they'd landed wanted to give him a medal. The passengers had started a fund to thank him, but Hal declined most of it. He attended one event, a private gathering organized by Captain Walsh and First Officer Torres, where they thanked him properly and shared contact information. Walsh gave him a model of a 737 with a small plaque. "To Ugly Six, when we needed a miracle, you showed us we had the tools all along. Blue skies and tailwinds. Captain Jennifer Walsh and F/O Mike Torres, United 2847. 3 weeks after the incident, Hal returned home to his small house in San Diego. His daughter, who'd been frantic when she heard about the emergency, met him at the door. "Dad, you're home. Are you okay? Really okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just tired." She hugged him tightly. "Dad, I had no idea. All these years, I knew you'd been a pilot, but I didn't understand what that really meant. What you'd really done. I've been reading about you, about your service, about what you accomplished. Why didn't you ever tell me?" Hal smiled and kissed her forehead. "Because it was a different life, a long time ago. I was a different person then." "Were you?" she asked. "Because from what I saw on the news, you're the same person you always were. When people needed help, you helped them. When people were in danger, you used your skills to save them. That's who you've always been. That evening, Hal sat in his backyard, looking up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. He thought about the flight, about the fear in the cockpit, about the trust Captain Walsh had shown in letting a strange old man help fly her aircraft. He thought about all the years since he'd retired, living quietly, keeping his head down, avoiding attention. He'd convinced himself that his flying days were behind him, that his skills were obsolete, that he was just another old man waiting out his final years. But up in that cockpit, with lives hanging in the balance, he'd felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Purpose, usefulness, the satisfaction of applying hard-won knowledge to solve a critical problem. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Captain Walsh. "Mr. Bennett, just wanted you to know, I started my carrier check ride today. The examiner asked about Flight 2847. When I told the story, he said every pilot should be so lucky to have someone like you in their corner when things go wrong. He's right. Thank you for being there. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. And thank you for reminding us that experience and wisdom never become obsolete. Safe skies, Captain Walsh." Hal smiled and typed back, "The pleasure was mine, Captain. You and Torres are fine pilots. Keep flying. Keep learning. And someday, when you're old like me, pass it forward to the next generation. That's how knowledge survives." Blue skies. Hal. A few days later, Hal received an unexpected visitor. A young man in a flight suit knocked on his door, introducing himself as Lieutenant Marcus Chun from the F-35 Squadron that had escorted Flight 2847. "Mr. Bennett, I hope I'm not intruding. I'm Viper 11. I was the pilot who flew over the crash site. I wanted to meet you in person." "Come in, Lieutenant," Hal said, genuinely pleased. "Can I get you some coffee?" They sat in Hal's modest living room, talking about flying. Chin explained that he'd grown up reading about Vietnam air combat, about the legendary pilots like Hal who'd flown impossible missions and survived. "You inspired me to become a pilot," Chin said. "You and others like you. When I heard you were on that flight, that you'd help land it, sir, I had to meet you. Had to thank you for everything you've done." "I appreciate that, Marcus. May I call you Marcus?" "Of course, sir. Tell me about your F-35. How does she handle?" They spent 2 hours talking shop, about aerodynamics and tactics, about the differences between the old F-4 Phantoms Hal had flown and the modern stealth fighters Chin flew. Despite the decades of technological advancement between their aircraft, the fundamentals remained the same. Physics doesn't change, and neither does the need for skilled pilots who understand those fundamentals. "Sir," Chin said as he was leaving, "would you be willing to come speak to our squadron? Share some of your experiences? We have young pilots who could learn so much from you." Hal hesitated. "Marcus, I'm 82 years old. I'm not sure what I could teach pilots flying fifth-generation fighters." "You could teach us what you taught Captain Walsh and her crew," Chin replied. "That experience matters. That knowledge earned through hard lessons has value. That we should never be so confident in our technology that we forget the fundamental skills. That's not about the specific aircraft, sir. That's about being a pilot, and that never changes." Hal thought about it, then nodded. "All right, I'll do it." Over the following months, Hal spoke to Chen's squadron, then to other military and civilian pilot groups. He told stories, not to glorify himself, but to teach lessons, about staying calm in emergencies, about trusting your training, about the importance of understanding your aircraft so deeply that you can fly it even when systems fail. But more than that, he talked about humility, about recognizing that you don't know everything, no matter how experienced you are, about being willing to accept help, like Captain Walsh had done, about respecting the knowledge of those who came before you. 1 year after the incident, United Airlines invited Hal to attend a ceremony commemorating the emergency landing of Flight 2847. All the passengers were invited, along with the crew and the emergency responders. Hal almost didn't go. He still felt uncomfortable with attention, but his daughter convinced him. "Dad, those people want to thank you. Let them." At the ceremony, held in a hotel ballroom, Hal sat quietly in the back until he was called forward. Captain Walsh and First Officer Torres were there, along with the flight attendants and many of the passengers. A representative from United spoke about the incident, about the investigation that had revealed a cascading failure caused by a manufacturing defect that had gone undetected through multiple inspections, about how the pilots had performed flawlessly under conditions that should have been unsurvivable. "But we're here today," the representative said, "because of one additional factor. The presence of a man who had the knowledge, the experience, and the courage to step forward when he was needed. Mr. Harold Bennett, would you please come forward?" Hal walked to the front of the room, moving slowly, leaning slightly on his cane. The room erupted in applause, every passenger, every crew member, standing and clapping. Captain Walsh hugged him. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Hal was asked to say a few words. He stood at the podium, looking out at the faces of people he'd helped save, and felt the weight of all those years of flying, all those experiences, all that knowledge he'd kept quiet about for so long. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, "but I want you all to understand something. That day, on that flight, you saw the best of aviation. You saw two pilots who refused to give up, who used every bit of their training and skill to bring you home safely. You saw flight attendants who kept calm and kept you calm. You saw passengers who followed instructions, even when they were terrified." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Someone asked me if I was scared up there in that cockpit. The truth is, I wasn't. Not because I'm brave, but because I was too busy to be scared. I was doing what I'd spent a lifetime learning to do. And that's the lesson I hope you take from this. Skills matter. Knowledge matters. Experience matters. Not so you can show off or feel superior, but so that when the moment comes, when someone needs help and you're the only one who can give it, you're ready." He looked directly at the passengers. "You folks were lucky that day. Lucky to have skilled pilots. Lucky to have a good aircraft that held together long enough. And yes, lucky that I happened to be on board. But luck favors the prepared. Captain Walsh and First Officer Torres were prepared. That's why you're here." The applause came again, but Hal raised a hand. "One more thing. A lot of people have called me a hero because of what happened. I'm not. Heroes are the people who do their jobs under impossible circumstances, without recognition or thanks. Heroes are pilots who land damaged aircraft without anyone famous on board to get them in the news. Heroes are the mechanics who maintain these aircraft perfectly so emergencies like ours are rare. Heroes are the engineers who design safety systems that work. I was just a passenger who knew some things. The real heroes fly every day, keeping millions of people safe, and nobody knows their names." After the ceremony, many passengers approached Hal to thank him personally. Some cried. Some hugged him. Some just wanted to shake his hand. The businessman who'd sat next to him on the flight, who'd barely acknowledged his existence before the emergency, approached with his young daughter. "Mr. Bennett, this is Emily. She's 9 years old, and she wants to be a pilot when she grows up. Because of you." Emily looked up at Hal with wide eyes. "Is it true you saved everyone?" "The pilots saved everyone," Hal said, kneeling to her level despite his protesting knees. "I just helped a little bit." "But you knew what to do because you've been a pilot for a long time, right?" "That's right. So if I become a pilot and learn a lot, maybe someday I can help people too?" Hal smiled, his eyes misty. "Emily, if you become a pilot, you'll help people every day. Every time you fly an aircraft safely from one place to another, you're helping hundreds of people get where they need to go. And if you learn your job really well, then yes, someday you might help people in a special way when they really need it. That's a wonderful goal. Will you tell me about flying?" Emily asked. Her father started to apologize. "I'm sorry, Mr. Bennett. I'm sure you're tired." "No, it's fine," Hal said. He sat down in a nearby chair and spent the next 20 minutes telling Emily about flying, about the feeling of freedom it brings, about the responsibility of having people's lives in your hands, about how you never stop learning. As he talked, he realized something. This was why he'd been on that flight. Not just to help in an emergency, but to inspire someone like Emily, to show her and others that knowledge and skill gained over a lifetime never lose their value. That experience should be respected and learned from, not dismissed or forgotten. 5 years after the incident, Hal Bennett passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 87. His obituary mentioned his combat service, his test pilot career, and the emergency landing he'd helped facilitate. But what made the news wasn't just his death, it was the response. Hundreds of pilots, from commercial airlines to military squadrons, attended his funeral. The F-35 squadron from San Diego performed a flyover, the missing man formation, with one aircraft peeling away to symbolize a fallen comrade. Captain Jennifer Walsh, now herself training to command her own airline, spoke at the service. "Harold Bennett taught me something that no training program ever could," she said. "He taught me that being a good pilot isn't about ego or confidence. It's about humility. It's about recognizing when you need help and being willing to accept it. It's about respecting the knowledge and experience of those who came before you." He saved 163 lives that day because he knew things that aren't in any manual. And he taught us that wisdom like that should never be dismissed just because it comes from someone old, or quiet, or seemingly ordinary. Among the mourners was Emily Chun, no longer 9 years old but 24, wearing the uniform of a freshly commissioned Air Force pilot. She'd kept in touch with Hal over the years, asking his advice as she pursued her dream of flying. He'd mentored her through flight school, shared stories and lessons, helped her become the pilot she dreamed of being. At the reception after the funeral, Emily found Hal's daughter. "Mrs. Parker, I wanted you to know that your father changed my life. I wouldn't be wearing this uniform if not for him." Amy Parker smiled through her tears. "He'd be so proud of you. He talked about you often. Said you were going to be a great pilot." "I'm going to try," Emily said. "And I'm going to do what he did, pass forward what I learned. Make sure the next generation knows that experience matters, that knowledge should be honored, that we stand on the shoulders of people like your father." "That's exactly what he would have wanted," Amy said. In his will, Hal had left his old F-4 helmet, the one he'd worn in Vietnam, to the Naval Aviation Museum. But he'd left something else to Emily, his flight logbook, containing records of every flight he'd ever made across more than 6 decades of flying. The last entry, written in his shaky handwriting just a week before he died, read, "To whoever reads this, flying has been my life's greatest joy. But the true joy of flying isn't the freedom or the speed or the technology. It's the privilege of being part of a community of aviators that stretches back over a century. We teach each other. We learn from each other. We save each other. Never forget that you're part of something bigger than yourself. Honor those who taught you. Teach those who come after you. And remember that the day you think you know everything is the day you become dangerous. Blue skies and tailwinds to all who follow. Harold Ugly Six Bennett." Emily closed the logbook carefully, tears streaming down her face. She would keep it safe, treasure it, and someday pass it on to another young pilot who needed to understand what Hal had understood. That aviation wasn't just about machines and technology. It was about people, knowledge, and the unbroken chain of wisdom passed from one generation to the next. 10 years after Flight 2847's emergency landing, Captain Jennifer Walsh stood in front of a classroom at the airline's training center. She was now a check airman, responsible for training and evaluating other pilots. On the screen behind her was a presentation titled, "Emergency Decision Making, Lessons from Flight 2847. "What I'm about to tell you," she began, addressing a room full of young pilots, "isn't in any manual. It's not part of your standard emergency procedures, but it might be the most important lesson you ever learn." She told them the story, about the cascading failures, about losing systems one by one, about the moment when an elderly passenger offered to help, and she had to decide whether to trust him. "Everything in my training told me to handle it ourselves," Walsh said. "We're the professionals. We're trained for this. Who was this old man to tell us how to fly our aircraft?" But something in his voice, in his eyes, told me he knew what he was talking about. So I made a choice that went against protocol. I let him in the cockpit. I listened to him. I trusted him. She clicked to the next slide, showing the aircraft resting in the grass field, surrounded by emergency vehicles. That choice saved 163 lives. Because Harold Bennett didn't just have knowledge, He had wisdom. He dealt with emergencies we'd only read about. He understood system failures at a fundamental level because he'd helped design those systems. He knew things that weren't in our manuals because he'd learned them the hard way, through decades of experience. A young first officer raised his hand. "Captain, how did you know he was legitimate? How did you know you could trust him?" "I didn't," Walsh admitted. "Not with certainty. But I recognized something in how he talked about the problems we were facing. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't theorizing. He was speaking from experience. And more importantly, he wasn't trying to take over. He was offering to help. That's a crucial distinction." She advanced to the next slide, showing a photo of Hal in his younger days, wearing his flight suit and standing in front of an F-4 Phantom. This was Harold Bennett in 1970. Call sign Ugly 6. He flew 247 combat missions in Vietnam. After the war, he became a test pilot. He helped develop the fly-by-wire systems that are now standard on almost every modern aircraft. He was a legend in aviation circles, but most people had never heard of him because he was humble. He didn't seek attention. He just did his job. She paused, making eye contact with the young pilots. "Here's what I need you to understand. Someday, each of you will face an emergency. And when you do, you might get help from an unexpected source. Maybe it's an old pilot sitting in your cabin. Maybe it's a mechanic who's worked on aircraft for 40 years. Maybe it's someone who doesn't have all the fancy modern training, but has something equally valuable, experience and wisdom. Don't let ego or protocol blind you to that help. Don't assume that because someone is old or speaks differently or doesn't have current credentials that they can't contribute. The best pilots are the ones who recognize that they don't know everything and who are willing to learn from anyone who has something to teach." After the class, a young pilot named Marcus, coincidentally the same name as the F-35 pilot who'd visited Hal years before, approached Walsh. "Captain, that story really affected me. Is there any way to, I don't know, systematize it? Make sure that kind of knowledge gets preserved?" Walsh smiled. "That's exactly the right question. And yes, there is. Ever since Flight 2847, the airline industry has been working on something called the Aviation Heritage Knowledge Program. It pairs experienced retired pilots with active crews for mentorship and knowledge transfer. We're building a database of edge cases, unusual emergencies, and lessons learned that aren't in standard training." "How can I get involved?" "Start by respecting experience when you encounter it. Listen to the old-timers, even when their stories seem irrelevant. Ask questions. Learn not just procedures, but the reasons behind them. And someday, when you're the experienced one, pass it forward." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Captain, can I ask you something personal? Do you ever think about what would have happened if Mr. Bennett hadn't been on that flight?" Walsh was quiet for a moment. "Every day. We might have made it. We were doing everything right. But honestly, I don't think so. We were minutes from losing all control authority. Without his guidance about isolating the electrical systems and managing the hydraulics, I think we would have gone down in the mountains. All those people would have died. That must be a heavy thing to carry." "It is, but it's also a gift, because it taught me humility. It taught me that I don't have all the answers, no matter how well trained I am. And it taught me to recognize wisdom when I encounter it, regardless of where it comes from." 15 years after the incident, Emily Chun, now Captain Chen, found herself in a situation that eerily echoed Hal's experience. She was flying from Tokyo to San Francisco when her aircraft experienced a sudden decompression at 41,000 feet. The emergency descent was routine, textbook perfect. But as they leveled off at a safe altitude and assessed the damage, they discovered a problem. The decompression had damaged some of the aircraft systems in unusual ways. The backup systems were working, but behaving oddly, displaying conflicting information, making the aircraft harder to control than it should be. Emily and her first officer worked through their checklists, but something wasn't adding up. The situation was manageable, but not quite right. They weren't in immediate danger, but Emily had a nagging feeling they were missing something. Then she remembered Hal's words, "Never let ego prevent you from asking for help." She picked up the passenger address system. "Ladies and gentlemen, This is Captain Chun. We've had a minor technical issue that we're resolving. Out of an abundance of caution, I'm asking if there are any pilots or aviation engineers on board who might be willing to come to the cockpit and provide a second opinion on some technical readings we're seeing. 2 passengers came forward. One was a retired Boeing engineer who had worked on the 777 they were flying. The other was a current Air Force pilot flying home on leave. With their input, Emily quickly identified the problem, a cascading failure in the backup electrical system similar to what Flight 2847 had experienced years before. But because she'd sought help early, before the situation became critical, they were able to resolve it using procedures that the engineer remembered from the aircraft development, but that had never made it into the standard manuals. They landed safely at San Francisco. The passengers never knew how close they'd come to experiencing something much worse. After the flight, the Boeing engineer shook Emily's hand. "Captain, I have to say, in 30 years of aviation, that's the first time a pilot has ever asked me for help during a flight. Most would have been too proud. I learned from someone who taught me that pride can kill you," Emily replied, "and that the smartest pilots are the ones who recognize when they need help." "Who taught you that?" "A man named Harold Bennett, call sign Ugly Six." The engineer's eyes widened. "You knew Ugly Six?" "He mentored me when I was young, changed my whole perspective on what it means to be a pilot. He was a good man. I met him once, years ago, at a conference. He spent 2 hours patiently explaining some technical concept to me, even though I was just a junior engineer and he was a legend. That humility, that willingness to share knowledge, that's rare." "He believed knowledge was meant to be shared," Emily said, "not hoarded. I try to honor that." 20 years after Flight 2847, the incident had become a case study taught in flight schools around the world, not just as an example of emergency procedures, but as a lesson in crew resource management, decision-making, and the value of expertise. A documentary was made about the incident, interviewing survivors, crew members, and aviation experts. The title, Ugly Six, the passenger who saved 163 lives. But perhaps the most lasting legacy was something quieter, less dramatic, but more important. In cockpits around the world, pilots began to change how they thought about experience and expertise. They became more willing to ask for help, more open to unconventional solutions, more respectful of knowledge that came from unexpected sources. The aviation industry established formal programs to capture and preserve the knowledge of retiring pilots and engineers. The Aviation Heritage Knowledge Program that Walsh had mentioned grew into a comprehensive system, ensuring that wisdom earned through decades of experience wouldn't be lost when people retired. And young people like Emily Chun, inspired by stories of people like Al Bennett, entered aviation not just to fly, but to become part of something larger, a community of knowledge that stretched across generations. In a small regional airport in Virginia, the same airport where Flight 2847 had made its emergency landing, a plaque was mounted on the wall of the terminal. It read, "On this site, United Airlines Flight 2847 made an emergency landing on May 15, 2023, saving 163 lives through the skill of the crew and the wisdom of passenger Harold Ugly Six Bennett." Let this serve as a reminder that expertise has no age limit. Wisdom comes from experience, and the greatest pilots are those humble enough to accept help when it's offered. Blue skies and tailwinds to all who follow. Beneath the plaque was a bench, and on the bench, people often found retired pilots sitting, watching aircraft take off and land, remembering their own years in the sky. Sometimes, young pilots would sit beside them and ask questions. The old pilots would share stories, offer advice, pass along wisdom earned through thousands of hours in the air. And in those moments, Hal Bennett's legacy lived on, not in monuments or fame, but in the simple act of one generation teaching the next, ensuring that knowledge survived, that wisdom persisted, and that when the next emergency came, someone would be ready. Because that's what Hal had understood, what he tried to teach anyone who would listen. Aviation isn't just about flying. It's about community. It's about respect for those who came before and responsibility for those who come after. It's about recognizing that you're part of something bigger than yourself, something that began with the Wright brothers and will continue long after you're gone. Your job isn't to be the best pilot who ever lived. Your job is to be a link in the chain, learning from those before you, contributing your own experience, and teaching those who follow. That's what Hal had done. That's what Captain Walsh had done. That's what Emily Chin was doing. And that's what thousands of pilots around the world, inspired by their example, would continue to do. The knowledge would survive. The wisdom would persist. The community would endure. And somewhere, in whatever afterlife existed for pilots, Hal Bennett was smiling, knowing that the lessons he'd learned and shared would keep people safe for generations to come. Because in the end, that's what mattered. Not the individual flights, or the personal glory, or the recognition and fame. What mattered was the knowledge passed forward, the wisdom shared, the lives saved by people who were prepared when their moment came. Ugly Six had found his moment at 38,000 feet, in a crippled aircraft, decades after anyone thought he had anything left to contribute. And his moment had changed everything.